Installing a DC to DC charger into your motorhome. Hi folks, I'm Roger from Offgrid, and in this episode I'm going to take you through quite a lot of detail on how you install one of these into a motorhome. I'll cover the reasons why, cover some best practices, and show you hopefully practically how you would actually do it. By the end of this video, it should be possible for you to buy one of these, and if you're reasonably handy yourself, to be able to do the full installation from beginning to end. So let's go. In this diagram, I'm going to show you what your motorhome probably comes with. So in this particular episode, we're not really covering the PVCs, which is a panel van conversion, so your standard conversions of Mercedes Sprinters or VW Transporters or the sort of Nissan and Peugeot equivalents, Peugeot Boxer or whatever. So we're not going to cover the panel van conversions. We're covering in this particular episode motorhomes that are being bought from sort of general manufacturers, and they could be Heimer or Euromobile or Rapido or so many different makes. Those motorhomes will all have one thing in common, which is they have an existing what we call an EBL or electroblock. By electroblock we mean the sort of box of you got loads of wires coming in and loads of wires coming out. You've got your 220 volt coming in, you got a load of fuses probably, and your electroblock is then connected to the panel that sits above the door, and it controls everything that happens in the motorhome. So it controls your water pump and whether your heating is on or off, and sometimes the heating itself and stuff like that. So in this diagram here, we're showing the basic installation of a motorhome as it comes out of the factory. So you're going to have a red wire or a positive wire. They don't always use red. A positive wire coming from the starter battery. So this is the starter battery, positive terminal, and it's going to come across to the electroblock. We've shown it coming up sort of in the air like this, but in reality everything is going to be going down through either under the chassis in conduits or in the false floor or something like that. So they'll be coming via one route or another from your positive terminal on your battery all the way through to the electroblock. Typically what we find is that there are some 6 millimeters. The more modern motorhomes have bigger ones, so sometimes 10 millimeter square cable. Yeah, they don't generally put thick cables going along there, because traditionally the split charge system, which is basically a relay, it might not be your standard 5-pin or 4-pin Bosch relay. It might be a different type of relay, but basically it's usually a relay. And with the old lead acid technology, there's not much that flows through there, so they don't need to worry about thick cables. So got a positive coming from your battery terminal, and that's going to be anywhere sort of 3 to 5 meters in length, and then from your electroblock to the leisure battery is usually a very short run, and that is again probably 6 millimeters or sometimes even less, even 4 millimeters coming from there to the actual battery itself. The negative terminal from the starter battery is going to be wired to the chassis somewhere. This is a standard European approach. So the negative terminal will be wired to the chassis, direct to the chassis, probably in the engine compartment somewhere via a fairly short and usually quite thick cable. It needs to be thick because the starter needs to run through it. So I've never found that cable to be thin. I'd say never less than 25 mil. So that's a good cable there. Your leisure battery, which in this case is probably a lead acid, is going to be also attached to the negative of that, will be attached to the chassis via a cable of whatever size it is. We find there's quite a lot of variation. Sometimes the cable is a decent thick one, but sometimes they are quite thin. So typically we find that they're 6 millimeters or even 4 millimeters. Very seldom will this be of a really decent thickness, so maybe up to 10, but never a 16. I've never seen a 16 on that one. So this is your standard build that comes out of the factory. What will happen is that your alternator, so this is the engine with the alternator, kicks out a D+, which is the thing that activates the coil in the relay, and that then basically, to all intents and purposes, bridges your leisure battery with your starter battery. And in so doing, as the alternator is charging one, it's charging both, and they are in theory at the same voltage. They're bridged as if they're one battery. The alternator doesn't know that they're two batteries. It just sends out current at whatever voltage it's set to, and in theory, they're in charge in that way. So there's no conditioning of power. There's no making sure that this is exactly the right voltage for what it needs. It's just at the mercy essentially of the starter battery, well, more the alternator, and sometimes the wiring. If it's long thin wire, it can drop voltage there. So that's the standard approach out of a motorhome. Now if I put that to one side, once you install the DC to DC, essentially what you're going to be doing is, you can see here we've run a new cable from the positive terminal of the battery to the left input. So if you look at the DC to DC, the left one here is in positive, so your red cable is going to go into this particular connector here, and the maximum size that this can take is 16 mil. So if you have one that's thicker, so if you want to run, say for example, a 25 mil, you'll need to make a plan to reduce the size of the 25 right here to 16. 16 is the max that this can take. So let's talk about this cable for a bit. We recommend you put in a 16 millimeter squared cable if you're going to run a new cable. Now, if you're lucky and this cable was a really substantial one, say 16 mil, then you can reuse this because it can carry the current. Now, bear in mind there are a number of variables in this equation, in that the length of these cables plays quite a big role. And we would suggest, if you're unsure about what size cables to run, that you get hold of a wire sizing app, and you can plug in all of the sums into that, or all the facts and figures, and it will come out and tell you the size of cable that you need. It will also be intelligent enough to tell you, according to the temperature rating of the cable, what thickness of cable you would want. Let me just elaborate on that a little bit. Invariably, this run is sort of 2 or 3 meters, and invariably this run again is another 2 or 3 meters. We show it as being a lot longer, but in reality that's just to show that it's separate from this one. So this one could be, let's call it 2 to 3 meters, and you'll need to just take into account that the longer this cable is, the more voltage drop you get along it, potentially the more heating. If you had a motorhome that you have quite a long run of this cable, just do your sums, but it might be that you eventually get to the point where a 25 mil cable is better than a 16 mil. Just means that the cable heats up a bit less and has less voltage drop. We find the thinner cables, that coming down to sort of thinnish wires, 4 mil or even 6 mil, have a reasonable amount of heat buildup, and you can drop voltage quite considerably. So use a wire sizing app and do your sums, and take into account that you'll need to know the temperature rating of your cable. It's always safe to go with 60 degrees centigrade on the cable, because even at 60 the cable is getting quite warm. The sort of next size up that all these wire sizing apps use is 75 degrees centigrade, and that's starting to actually get quite hot. You're not far off getting really hot water if you heated it to 75. You certainly wouldn't be able to put your hand in there and leave it in there. It would be too hot. So stick with 60 degrees centigrade and size those. But a good rule of thumb, if your cable run is 2, 3, and maybe even 4 meters, a 16 mil cable would be absolutely fine. So you're going to run a brand new cable from your battery, whichever route you're going to take, and bring it to the DC to DC, which is the left connection. You're going to place a fuse as close to the engine, as close to the starter battery as possible. So in all cases, you're going to want to put fuses as close to the source of the power. And this fuse can be anything from 40 to 60 amps. You don't want more than 60, because you want the fuse to be the first thing that blows. So there's no point in putting a 100 amp fuse on this line there, because by the time the fuse blows, you're going to have lots of things happening, potentially melting and damage and that sort of stuff. So you're going to want a fuse that exceeds what it will be drawn through the cable, but not so big that it doesn't blow fast enough and the damage is incurred if you do actually have a short or something over here or something goes wrong here. So 40 to 60 amp fuse here, and you may as well put the same here. So you put a fuse here, and again you're going to want 40 to 60 amp. Now let's just talk a little bit about fuses again. We recommend you go for something like a MIDI fuse. If you know your fuses, you get basically MIDIs and mega fuses. The mega fuses, you can get low current, but it's really easy to do this with a MIDI fuse. I'll show you what a MIDI fuse looks like. So this is a Victron MIDI fuse. They're very similar. In fact, they're identical to bow jacks, which are very popular on Amazon and eBay, but we like to put proper Victron things in. This is really, really important. You've got to get a good quality fuse. It's no use skimping money on the fuse quality. You want to get something that you know has been rated to blow at 60 amps. There are a number of YouTubes where the guys have tested cheap fuses to see at which point they blow, and it's quite surprising how many fuses blow way, way above their rating. You don't mind it being a little bit above, but you certainly don't want it more than, say, 10% out or so. So this is a Victron fuse, 60 amp fuse. This is what I would use. So I'd use one of these over here and one over here, and then that will protect everything. Your negative lines don't get fused, so this one that comes straight to the chassis, you'll notice in your engine compartment that is not fused. Goes straight down there. You're going to be running a new cable from your DC to DC charger that you're going to run basically possibly to the battery negative terminal as well as the chassis. Now that may just go to a single bus bar, and that's a pretty good way to do it. So, but you're going to want to run a similar size cable from your negative, which is the center one. So if we look at that, it's the ground or negative that's in the center. You're going to want to run that down to either your bus bar, to your battery, or to the chassis. But essentially you want a really good connection from the center one here down to the battery, because that's where you're going to be pushing a lot of current. But at the same time, in order for this all to operate, it actually needs to go down to the chassis because it needs to be joined to this. So important concept, sorry to repeat myself, important concept, your negative, your center one, must be a good cable connection to the negative of the battery as well as your chassis. These negative wires, there is a misconception out there that most of your current is carried by the positive cable and that your negative cable can be a much thinner black cable. That is highly debatable, because if you put a smart shunt, for example, into the situation, you'll be putting it on the negative cable, not on the positive cable. And so your negative cable is actually carrying just as much current as your positive cable. So I would not go, I would certainly not say, well, I'm putting 16 on this main positive line and then I'm happy with 10 or 6 coming down from there to the battery and to the chassis. I would put the same size cable there. So this concludes the basic idea of how you're going to wire it up, but I'm just going to show you 2 more things now. The problem that you would face, and I'm not going to go into the detail of this, I'm just going to point it out to you. The problem that you would face is that you're going to have 2 competing circuits charging that battery from the same source, from the starter battery or the alternator. And so you're going to be charging through your DC-DC, and you're also going to be charging through your EBL, through your split charge system. So you're probably going to want a cutoff relay that when it detects D plus coming from your alternator, it is going to cut this circuit. So in the previous diagram, as you can see, the circuit is intact. And in fact, in this particular scheme of things, you would definitely have 2 competing charging systems running off the same source, and this one would be conditioning the power, and this one wouldn't if it's a simple split charge relay, and that's going to cause problems because this is going to be putting in this exact same voltage as that is, and this is going to be conditioning to what the battery needs, especially if you have a lithium battery, and that's going to be a problem. If you have lead acid in both batteries, then that's fine. You don't need to worry about that. But if this one, for example, is a lithium, so call it Life Pure 4. This is lithium and this is lead acid, or floating lead acid, I think is correct term. Then you don't want this solution. You actually want to install a relay over here to act as a cutoff. Now, this will be covered in a separate video, but I just wanted to bring your attention to it. So the last thing I'll do is point you to this particular slide, which is where we have changed this actually to a cutover relay. This can happen when the EBL requires some power coming in there to operate. It can't be without that power. Things go wrong. So you can't just simply cut that and hope that everything will work. Things like the fridge stop working, etc. So you need some power in there, and we're using a 5-pin relay as a changeover relay, not a cutoff relay. But that's for another video. If we come back to the basic installation of what we're looking at, this is it here. We're using the Victron, in this particular example, the 12 to 12 at 30 amps. And yeah, I'm going to show you the actual wiring of it, but I'm going to talk about one more thing just before we actually get into the wiring, which is how will this activate? How does it know when the engine is running? So one of the reasons that you want to install this is that when the engine is running and there is surplus power coming from the alternator, you want it then to charge. When the engine is not running, it must leave the starter battery alone, because it's critical that this battery is maintained and is able to start your vehicle. You don't want to be in the middle of nowhere and you can't start because this has been drained to charge that. So there, we will cover that in more detail, but essentially there are two methods to use for this, which is to have this little green thing just bridge the way it is here. So this little green thing is just a simple wire that bridges these two contacts. So this is the mode L and H, and so this is the default install, where that simply sits there and bridges that. But one of the things that you can do is you can actually take this black wire out, and you can bring a D plus signal to the H terminal, so the one on the right over here. So this one over here, you can bring a D plus to that, which will then mean that this can only be activated and start charging when the D plus has got 12 volt positive on that. And in which case the DC to DC charger will be activated based on the voltage that it detects, especially on the in, so between these two. So if it's measuring whatever you've set in this, you configure in the app, it must have met that voltage, and D plus must be active, and that's a really safe way of doing it. And you would also use D plus for your relay, but that's for another video. So just to practically demonstrate how it could look, we've just got an old lead acid, which this simulates the starter battery, and a leisure battery, in this case a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate. So we've got the Orion-Tr Smart here, 12-12-30. That means it's 12 volts in, 12 volts out, and maximum of 30 amps coming into the battery. Just a little note on that, something that occurred to me that I hadn't explained earlier. When we say it's 30 amps, in fact, on this particular cable coming in from the lead acid battery, from the starter battery, it can be more than 30 amps. And that is because, let's say that we've set this to charge at 14 volts. So it's going to put 14, probably the default for a lithium iron phosphate Victron is 14.2 volts. So it's going to, if we tell the DC to DC charger that it's charging a lithium iron phosphate battery, it's going to expect to put out 14.2 volts. Quite often, the alternator is not actually producing as much as 14.2 volts. So what this is going to do is it's going to pick up whatever voltage is coming down the wire, and it's going to increase it in order to put 30 amps into the battery. That means that this cable coming from the starter battery, which as I said could be sort of a 3-meter run or so, sometimes longer, is going to potentially carry more than 30 amps. Experience says if this is charging to its absolute maximum, that along this cable here, it's going to draw usually about 33 amps, sometimes a bit more if the voltage of the alternator is lower. And interestingly, some of the more modern vehicles have lower voltage alternators, strangely enough. That's just been our experience. And so you could expect this cable to carry anywhere up to 35 amps. So don't base your calculations or your wire sizing purely on 30 amps. Base it on, I'd say, at least 35 amps just to be safe. So we have a 16mm wire coming from the starter battery. As I said, probably a 3-meter run or so, 2 or 3 meter, and it's coming in and it's fused over here. So it's fused with the MIDI fuse very close to here. These fuses, it's safe to put them in. They have 5mm bolts, so you're going to put in this line here, you're going to put 2 5mm lugs so that the 5mm lugs come out nice and straight. Put in your 60 or 40 to 60 amp fuse, and then close this up. And these close up quite nicely. They close up nice and snug. So once they've clipped in, they don't come apart very easily. Some people, just for peace of mind, will put a cable tie around this just to hold it together, and then it can just sit there as an inline fuse. So you don't have to mount this to a surface anywhere. Quite often in the battery compartment there is no room anyway to do that. So just treat it as an inline fuse, as close to your battery as possible. So if anything happens further on down, that this blows and there's just a short length from the battery terminal to the fuse holder, and hopefully nothing's going to happen in that little stretch. So the fuse blows and everything is protected. So you want a fuse there, and you want a fuse on the outgoing line, which is here, going out here on the right hand side, coming to your battery positive terminal. So you probably want to come straight out of here, have this mounted probably to a wall close by, within, sort of 20, at the most 20 centimeters or so from here, as close to this as possible. And then again, a 40 to 60 amp fuse in this MIDI fuse holder. We have done another video in detail on how you should put these cables in, but I thought I'd just cover this here. So you can see, if I pull this side, I haven't tightened this in yet. Rather than just putting bare wires, we highly recommend using ferrules. So this was a 16mm ferrule. A round ferrule. We then used our ferrule crimper to crimp it square like that. Cut off the end bit. We wanted about that long. So actually about the width of the ferrule crimper is ideal. And that's a perceiver crimper. So this is about the ideal length and nicely squared off. And that will then go into your terminals nice and safe. If I just nip them down a little bit, you'll see how safe everything is. Nothing can contact. Just tightening just slightly, just you can see they really nicely put in. There's no possibility of strands coming out and causing a short. And as I mentioned in the previous video, invariably when you're putting these things in, the DC-DC is mounted. It's got to be either this way or upside down so that these cooling fins can work. And it's very difficult to actually see under there. So once you've put a ferrule on, it makes it really easy to get it in, and you know there are no strands knocking about that you haven't seen. The activation, as I mentioned, could be done purely on voltage, or if you take out the little bit of wire that was there that bridged these two connectors, and then put a D plus into the right hand one. As you can see on here, you've got a L and H on the remote socket here. It's on the under the H, so on the right hand side under H. You want positive 12 volt DC coming in from your D plus and the alternator, and that will cause the thing to be activated alongside the voltage check. So both the start voltage must have been reached and D plus must be active for it to actually start charging. So in terms of the negatives, we've got one wire coming to the battery, and then this just simulates a wire going to the chassis. This simulates a wire going to the chassis. So all of these are basically together. All the negatives all come onto the chassis somewhere and are all one common negative throughout the whole vehicle. But I think that's about it. So hopefully that will help you to do the installation yourself. And if you have any questions, we'd be really happy to take them. So any comments would also be appreciated. And give us a hit the subscribe and hit the bell, as they all say. So we've produced a fairly comprehensive article on our website that explains pretty much everything that I've just explained here. So we'll include the link to that down below. And in that article, we've listed all of the components that we use, all of the tools that we've used, and just about everything that you need to do this installation. So it'd be great if you pop over and have a look at that article. And again, we'd really enjoy your feedback on how helpful it is. So folks, hopefully you found that useful, and we'll see you in the next episode. So have a good week.